Welcome to Life in the Law on the Think Tech Live streaming network series. My name is Danielle Conway, and today I'm here with Professor Justin Levinson from the William S. Richardson School of Law, and we're going to be talking about a very important topic called implicit bias in the law. It's an interesting topic and one that doesn't often get a lot of play in Hawaii, but it should. So Justin Levinson is going to be here to introduce us to the topic and also to tell us how it impacts Hawaii specifically. Justin, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me.
So tell me, you wrote this book, Implicit Bias in the Law. What prompted you to write the book?
So the book is an edited volume that's a compilation of a lot of scholars talking about implicit bias, what it is and what its implications are. What prompted me was the fact that social scientists had discovered amazing knowledge about how the human mind actually works with regard to inequality, and that we as policy and law scholars were not talking about the impacts that it was having all across society.
Why do you think we weren't talking about it? It's just off our radar screen?
I think people tend to compartmentalize sometimes. So in the law and policy circles, they're not turning towards the social sciences. So the social sciences developed these fascinating tests and wonderful theories about how the human mind actually works. And we, as people thinking about law and policy, are kind of stuck in our own debates. And so changing the orientation takes a bit of a push, and that's the purpose behind the book.
So with our interview today, I want to talk about theory, but I also want to talk about practice. I want to bring it up and bring it down and bring it back up again, and try to understand how implicit bias works in our theorizing in the law, but also what does it mean for the person walking on the street? Can we do that?
Yes, we can.
Excellent. So you say that law researchers are not really thinking about the social sciences. Why do we need to think about it as law researchers and as legal advocates? And what categories or segments of what we study are impacted by implicit bias?
Do you care about justice?
I do care about justice.
Okay, so do you see the everyday moment-to-moment connection between policy making, and justice?
Yes.
Okay, so that's what this is about, right?
Okay.
So when we talk about the social science, we're talking about how are people's lives affected on a moment-to-moment basis all the time. That's the starting point for this.
Okay,
So
good.
It's true that we have to develop the science to fit. So let's say we're going to talk about Hawaii's educational system and some of the problems and challenges, or the criminal justice system. Let's just take those as examples. We have to say, what is there that we can learn from the social sciences that will open up new discussions and directions?
So these new discussions can take us into certain places. You mentioned education. They can take us into certain places like the criminal justice system. They can take us into certain places like healthcare.
Yeah.
How are people treated in an unjust way according to stereotypes, for example?
Okay, so let's take the concept of implicit bias and then we can trace it across so that people who are concerned about justice in the criminal justice system, or in the educational system, or in the healthcare.
So let's start with the
system.
criminal justice
Okay,
system.
so the first step is, what do we mean by implicit bias and how is it measured? And then we can apply it throughout a concept like the criminal justice system. Implicit bias describes a very simple phenomenon, and that is how our minds work in automatic ways, right? Our brains are phenomenally powerful. So what happens inside these brains? How much of it are we aware of, and how much is helping us on a moment-to-moment basis? So for example, if you take a look around the room, right? We're on air, there's cameras in this room. If I'm looking at a camera, I'm looking around the room, I'm not just gonna stare at it and say, what is this thing? And I'm gonna look at it from all sides. I know it's a camera.
You're going to make assumptions about it.
I don't even need to, because I see the camera and I know it's a camera.
Right.
How?
Right.
Right? Schemas, right? Stereotypes come from our automatic cognitive processes. This is something that evolution has helped us with. Life would be near impossible if I didn't know that we were sitting at a table, right? I'd have to flip this thing up and People would be dumbfounded on a moment-to-moment
Right.
level. So to understand what implicit bias is, the first thing you have to know is that our mind does these things naturally.
Okay.
The problem is when stereotypes and negative associations that we learn throughout our lives are bombarded with from early childhood. The problem is when those block the kind of decision making that we think we want to have.
So it's one thing to say, that's a camera and I know what it does.
Right.
It's another thing to walk down the street and see a group of people, young people,
Yeah.
and they might be from one ethnic group and make associations, either negative or positive.
Cross the
about them.
street. They're up to no good. What are those
Right.
people doing? Right?
Right.
Cross the street. Right?
Okay.
That's fast, right? You're not thinking like, this person is from this group and I know, some people do, that's called explicit bias. When we're aware of our own biases and negative attitudes and stereotypes towards people, that's called explicit bias. But that's a smaller percentage of the population that will say, I have negative feelings towards members of this group, so I'm going to cross the street. The vast majority of us also have implicit biases, meaning we automatically have things triggered in our mind. Just like when I look at a camera and know it's a camera, I see a group of people from a certain group, things are triggered in my mind immediately. And if negative stereotypes are historically, media, right? If those are conveyed to us through stories, family, school, whatever it is, those are going to happen on an implicit level. And my implicit biases may be completely against my own values.
And it not only is against your own values, but it also could be incorrect about that group.
Oh, and it is often incorrect.
Okay.
Yes.
Do you have examples of these kinds of stereotypes and the negative impressions that happen to be incorrect?
Sure. I mean, so if you think about, there's criminal justice, but one simple example is employment context in the workplace. People automatically stereotype women as being associated with family and nurturing roles and not necessarily with professionalism. There's all kinds of studies on this, and these studies have shown that women in the workplace face a difficult time proving competence, toughness, and things like that. So that's one kind of easy to use example. But the criminal justice system is really one where this manifests all the time. So if you think about how does a person enter the criminal justice system, what's their experience like all the way through, and how do they hopefully exit the criminal justice system, the times that implicit bias can affect that person, and it's astronomical.
Yeah, at different phases when it becomes important not to
Right.
engage the stereotype.
Right. So policing is your first one, right?
Exactly.
The cop is driving down the street and sees the
Right.
group of teenagers. What is in the police officer's mind consciously, and what is automatically activated, right? Police are not out there by and large trying to target members of certain groups. But when stereotypes are activated by seeing certain groups, that is a concern. And if you look at the statistics of the Hawaii juvenile justice system, there's groups that are very disproportionately highly represented.
Interesting. So let me ask you a question about the book in particular. When you were writing the book and you were surveying those who could contribute to the book, were you just looking at these particular areas like the criminal justice system or education, or were you trying to get a broader swath?
So I'm glad you raised that. The purpose of the book is that this is about life. Right? It's about policy. It's not only about the criminal justice system. It's not only about the workplace. Those are the two areas that come to people's mind first, I think, when you talk about implicit bias, right? Hiring decisions and stereotypes, and how, when somebody sees a name on a resume, what's the effect? The criminal justice system, we can think, wow, we understand maybe it's not so hard to think how police are going to react differently to different group members, or even juries. But beyond that, you start taking areas like tax law and policy, and you say, well, how does the IRS come up with a policy to audit people who claim a certain tax credit but not other tax credits, right? And how might stereotypes play out in that? Or how might a corporate board decide to give charitable money to the opera but not to a charity that helps people in their own neighborhoods where the corporations are actually operating. So if you take the concept of implicit bias and you think in a broader level, right? You think about all these actors. You think about even tort law cases, right? Personal injury cases, how lives are valued. It opens up a whole conversation that people are not having.
That's interesting you mentioned tort law, because I had an exchange with another lawyer in town, very prominent lawyer, and one of his concerns is that he has to look at the client that he takes on to determine strategy, because that client may or may not be sympathetic to a jury. Is there a concern about implicit bias in that kind of scenario?
Well, so there's concerns about implicit bias on all sides, right? So one is, how's a jury and the judge going to perceive the plaintiff? That's a huge one. But even there's questions about how does a lawyer perceive a potential client, right?
Correct.
And then how does the client act? Right? That also is affected by implicit bias. If we have awareness of other stereotypes about us, there's something called stereotype threat. Things in us are triggered, and we actually often unconsciously perform in ways that are consistent with societal stereotypes about us. And that the education setting is a really big area where that's relevant.
So I say let's hold off on that, because I really do want to talk about the education setting, but I really want to get viewers to know what's in your book before we venture off into a particular area. So what were some of the more challenging topics that you covered in the book that didn't necessarily fit the model of general or traditional implicit bias scenarios?
Well, a lot of them hadn't been covered. So the project on corporations, I think, was an important one. There's a lot of people who are in one camp, kind of the pro-corporate capitalism camp or the anti-corporate camp. And I personally think that the lines don't need to be drawn so tightly. But thinking about how corporations act in society with regard to implicit bias is a really interesting and challenging one, because we talk about corporations and what is this legal personhood question, right? Well, if a corporation can act like a legal person, can a corporation act with implicit biases? So some of these are really interesting and fun. Healthcare was one that people had started talking about, but there haven't been that many studies on healthcare. One of the really interesting studies, though, found that when emergency room doctors were presented with cases of people who had come in with heart attack symptoms, their implicit biases about black patients affected their actual decision about how to treat that heart attack. And so taking that as a starting point and jumping off and thinking about how is somebody's health, right? Their health is so important, right? How are their everyday health interactions affected? So
and it's really important to collect that data, because once you're a patient in an emergency room, you don't have time to think about whether someone is exhibiting a bias that could actually harm your care or treatment.
And if you do, how do you react to that, right? So these are policy questions. It's a lot. I mean, there are things that people can try to do in those circumstances, but that's not the real answer to this. Another one I wanted to mention was indigenous peoples, right? So people hadn't really talked about what's the overlap between implicit bias and indigenous peoples, and in Hawaii we have a robust history of a self-governing Hawaiian monarchy, and we also have an overthrow. So what's the intersection here, and even in terms of Native peoples across the U.S. and the world with regard to implicit bias? And there's a fascinating chapter in the book about how implicit biases of Native peoples as incapable of self-governance has really infused itself into Supreme Court jurisdiction or jurisprudence and policy.
So I know you're excited, and we're going to talk about this when we come back, but we need to take a break. We are talking here with Professor Justin Levinson from the William S. Richardson School of Law. We are here, Life in the Law, on the Think Tech series, and we will be back in a few minutes.
Great, looking forward to it.
Aloha, I'm Nicole Horry for Think Tech. For nearly half a century, the Hawaii Foreign Trade Zone No. 9 has brought the benefits of the Foreign Trade Zone program to Hawaii businesses and entrepreneurs. DBET, the Department of Business, Economic Development, and Tourism, operates Hawaii's Foreign Trade Zone program to encourage international business and economic development. The Foreign Trade Zone's mission is to increase the amount of international trading activity in Hawaii, thereby providing employment opportunities for the residents of our island state. For more information, see ftz9.org. I'm Nicole Horry. Mahalo.
Welcome back. I'm Danielle Conway, and this is Life in the Law on Think Tech Streaming. I'm here with Professor Justin Levinson, and we're talking about implicit bias. So I wanted to hold off on the discussion about education. I really want to talk about implicit bias in education, particularly here in Hawaii. We have a system where the private schools are obviously preferred over the public schools. We have a system of truancy that has exacerbated. We have issues about immigrants entering into the society and how are they treated in terms of education. And I want to know whether implicit bias is playing a role in that and what we should do about it.
I mean, the answer is yes, implicit bias is playing a role in it, but it's obviously more complicated than that. So where is implicit bias playing a role? How do we document that? And what do we do about it, right? So I think you have to break down the elements. Where is implicit bias functioning in our education system? You mentioned public and private schools. This is a really interesting topic. So if you think about the debate that families have in Hawaii about where to send their child to school, it's actually quite different than in other locations where there are similarly public and private schools.
Okay.
There's a tremendous pressure in Hawaii for people to at least apply to private schools. And so one of the questions is, where does that come from? Just as an analogy, I ran into an old friend who has a child entering kindergarten. And she said, "Oh, I forgot that you have a child entering kindergarten." And I said, yeah, I do. And she said, "Oh, that's great that you're applying this year." And I said, "Well, what do you mean? What do you mean applying this year?" And she equated the entering of kindergarten with applying to private schools. That people don't enter kindergarten without applying to private schools. And I think that is actually a widely held belief in Hawaii, that you have to at least take a shot at private school. And I think that's actually one example of what could be an implicit bias that we have unique to Hawaii, whereby people implicitly associate public school with lower competence and private school with virtues, right? Competence and excellence.
Right.
And that may not be accurate of what's actually going on out there.
And so when you have families who cannot choose to go to private school, then they become subject to this implicit bias because they wind up at the, as you say, the non-virtuous school.
Right, it affects them for sure. And it affects others too, right? I mean, that shouldn't be the starting point for the education decision, right? Is an assumption that public schools are not competent, which could be completely false, right? Our public education system, like all, has things to deal with, right? But the assumption that competent students, I can tell you as a professor, competent students come out of our public school system. Amazing students come out of our public school
And at the
system.
law school, we have several of those competent students, so I can actually affirm that, right?
All the time, yeah. So where does the stereotype come from? What propagates it, and what's its effect, right?
So what do you think? Where does it come from?
Well, I'm not an expert on the history of schools in Hawaii, so I don't want to say what started it, but I think when you think about where implicit biases come from, they come from cultural stories and stereotypes that are propagated. So if there is a cultural story in Hawaii regarding private schools and power, for example, then you could look at that as a source of where some of these stories started and how over time they just grow.
And I think they grow also because there are networks that develop around the stories as well. There's this uncommunicated assumption when you have a conversation here in Hawaii that when you identify the school you've gone to, that everyone knows exactly the position that you hold.
Right, a social status. Right, and that is actually quite unique to Hawaii in that regard.
Okay. So other examples in the education system where
Good.
implicit bias shows
Yeah.
up?
So I think the public versus private debate is important, but that's not the biggest thing here. I
Okay.
mean, there's good reasons to choose private schools. There's good reasons to choose public schools. So that I think that's part of the important backdrop. But the real implicit bias issues here are in terms of academic performance, expectations of teachers, and the effect of implicit bias on the self. So how students perform. That's the story, I think.
Yeah,
So,
as a parent, I'm very much concerned about that last one, right? Because the pervasive nature of implicit bias and the stereotypes projected from the outside to the person, him or herself, can actually determine how that young person decides to react in a situation or respond in the education setting.
right, and it may not even be a conscious decision. So let's take, right, in the Hawaii education system, where's all the effort and funding? Test taking. Right, that's what everyone's not. I don't think that's necessarily the right thing to do, but let's just take test taking for example, because it is true that test taking is the gateway,
Okay.
right, to
success.
college,
Yes,
graduate
exactly.
school, right? So let's take test taking. Well, there's a phenomenon called stereotype threat. This has been documented for a long time. Stereotype threat means that when someone is aware of a stereotype about their own group membership, they perform that stereotype. Now that's an oversimplified way of saying it, but let's take a concrete example. The SATs.
Yes.
The first famous study on stereotype threat was done by Claude Steele and Josh Aronson at Stanford. And they took white and black college students at Stanford and had them take SATs. These are great, smart students, high SAT scores. The only difference was half the time they told the group, this is a diagnostic test of your ability. And the other half the time they told the group, this is just a problem-solving measure. We're going to try to help figure out how people solve problems. What they found was that when people were told that it was a diagnostic of ability, the white students did better than their baseline, and the black students did worse. And these are students who were essentially equal in terms of intellectual ability, academic performance, right? So that the test-taking threat, the stereotype threat, which was, I belong to a group that is either stereotyped as intelligent or stereotyped as not intelligent, the awareness of that stereotype actually boosted the white students' performance, hurt the black students' performance. And this has been documented in many different groups. So you take women, for example. Women who are, so the idea here is that you have to activate the group membership in some way. So asking people to self-identify by having them check a box on a test is the most obvious. But even telling people this is a measure of academic, or a measure of your academic ability, that can trigger it too. So women on a math test exhibit stereotype threat.
So we can actually prime these by asking those very basic questions. What's your ethnicity?
Yeah, I mean,
What's your
that
gender?
primes it.
Okay.
Absolutely. So, and it can be primed, sometimes it's so powerful that it can always be primed, right? So the stereotype of black students and academics is so strongly present that just telling people that this is a test, diagnostic of ability, does it even without asking them to say, what's your racial categorization or whatever.
Okay, so for those people who will definitely challenge what it is you're saying here, and why is that important? So if a person can be so easily swayed like that, why should we care about that? What's your response
Well, we're
to
not,
that?
because what we're doing is we're not taking the best students and then moving them forward, right? We're assuming that our tests and our test-taking circumstances are objective measures, right? So putting aside the question of whether the tests actually are biased in and of themselves, even an unbiased test can trigger stereotype threats so that the students with the highest scores are not always the best students.
So it seems that your response leads to a determination that this can negatively impact productivity and even efficiency by not necessarily getting the best out of all students.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, so if we use measures like standardized test scores as the largest measure of ability, we will, and then we select from the highest percentiles of that, we are leaving behind better students, smarter students.
I see.
Yeah.
I understand.
Yeah.
Can we switch gears then out of education?
Wait, can I say one more thing about education?
No, you can't. No,
Okay.
go ahead.
Well, let me just at least say, so
right ahead.
that's performance, but discipline is the other, right? So that, and this is another way, this is maybe even more, I mean, it's hard to say more important, but the way teachers and principals perceive deviant behavior in the school system is a major pipeline of implicit bias, right? So why is that student acting out? How do teachers attribute it, right? Are they attributing it to the situation, like, oh, this student must be tired or stressed out? Or do they think this kid is dangerous, right? So, and then if you look at the statistics on who is getting suspended versus just a talking to, and you just trace this nationally, it's a big problem.
I could stay on this topic, on the education topic, a long time. And I actually want to give you another example.
Oh, okay, good.
Because now you triggered another question.
Okay.
So in our school system in Hawaii, where students might actually be seen as better students if they comply with a certain type of social behavior, then that can also lead to quashing creativity then if what the child is doing is seen as something outside of the stereotypical norm. Is that possible?
Well, I think it's in all schools, so in Hawaii or beyond, right? There's always cultural norms in a school of what teachers and administrators are looking for, right?
Okay.
And if you are different from that stereotype, there's a risk there. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so the risk on both sides that we potentially squelch creativity, but in a more nefarious side, we actually label people in accordance with a stereotype that is not accurate and not appropriate.
Right. And sometimes that's automatic and not a conscious decision. Right.
And
that can trace to group membership or assumptions about a family, right? So a teacher who has a student and they have stereotypes about what families are like in this immigrant community, that's going to affect the way they perceive something as being, is it my kid being creative or is it this kid from a community where I have stereotypes being disruptive?
Interesting. I do want to switch to healthcare.
Yeah.
So in the healthcare arena, how does implicit bias play out? I have an example, and I don't know if I'm right on about this example, but if you go into an emergency room, for example, and you complain of a certain ailment or you complain of some chronic pain, depending on who you are, is implicit bias working when the care provider decides that you must be here for one thing and not really treatment?
Absolutely. I mean, the way that physicians, the way that triage nurses perceive the person who walks in is a major determinant of the kind of service that that person will receive, right? So, I mean, it's, in a sense, the healthcare industry is a service industry. So what kind of treatment do you get when you walk into a retail store? What kind of treatment do you get when you walk into a restaurant? What kind of treatment do you get when you walk into a hospital? These are all part of the same cognitive network of how people perceive you and the responses that they make. If a doctor has an implicit bias whereby they associate members of certain group with unhealthy lifestyle, non-compliant patient, those kinds of things, or inability to follow directions or desire not to follow directions, those things will be major determinants of health.
Interesting. And so what does that mean for responding to implicit bias in the arena that you work in? How do you teach these service providers that this is not necessarily the best way to provide the service?
Well, I think that's what you do.
Okay.
I mean, you have to teach them first.
Okay.
Most people in these industries and across society, really, the majority of people see themselves as egalitarian, that they want to treat people equally. If you take emergency room doctors and you get them into a room and you say, how many of you, believe that you should treat people similarly, regardless of their background, they'll raise their hands, all of them.
Okay. Well, you know what? You've done some work in this area. I want to take a break, and then I want to talk about the work you've done actually teaching people how to respond to their own implicit bias. My name is Danielle Conway. I'm here with Professor Justin Levinson from the William S. Richardson School of Law, and you're watching the Think Tech streaming series. We will be back in a moment.
I'm Hong Jiang, host for Asia in Review on Tuesdays.
And I'm David Day, host for Asian Review on Thursdays. Both of us broadcast our respective shows at 4 p.m.
And my topics tend to deal with questions related to environment, culture, history, and sometimes human rights.
And my shows tend to be on international business, foreign policy, geopolitics, and national security. And you can watch our shows live on the ThinkTech website at thinktechhawaii.com.
And you can also watch us on YouTube or Olalo.
So come join us on Thursdays at 4 p.m. I'm David Day.
And on Tuesdays at 4 p.m., I'm Hong Jiang.
Aloha.
Aloha.
Aloha, I'm Maria Kashem of Think Tech Hawaii, and I want to tell you about our Think Tech talk shows. If you didn't know it, Think Tech streams video and audio for all of its shows live on the internet from 2 to 5 p.m. every weekday afternoon, and we replay them all night long on ustream.tv. Visit thinktechhawaii.com for our live stream and YouTube links. Raise your awareness on Think Tech. I'm Maria Kashem, and I'll see you there.
We're back and we're live. My name is Danielle Conway. I'm here talking with Professor Justin Levinson from the William S. Richardson School of Law, and our topic today is implicit bias. Justin, we left the last segment talking about how to teach people about implicit biases that they do have,
Right.
and how to respond as service providers in our community. So what ways have you been involved in actually teaching people? Do you have some examples you can share with us about the trainings you've done?
Yeah, sure. Well, the first thing I would say is that you have to, if you want to think about training, there's work to be done there, right?
Okay.
So I'm not getting calls from Queens Hospital on a daily basis saying, "Oh, come train our."
But you should be,
physicians."
right?
Well, it doesn't mean that I have to be, but
Right.
these are things that they should be thinking about.
Okay.
So the good news is that the Hawaii judiciary is actually on top of these kinds of issues, at least as a starting point. And I have trained the Hawaii judges an hour and a half training. And they have since had a follow-up training with other faculty from the law school on this topic. And trainings have benefits, but superficial trainings don't work.
Okay.
So trainings are a science, right? If you think about what is implicit bias, how has it gotten into our minds, and then can I just rid it in 90
In a 90-minute session,
right?
it's not going to work.
Right. I might be able to diminish it for a while. I might be able to help motivate you to diminish it on your own after that. And I might be able to provide concrete strategies you can use. But doing that is not easy. So that's the first thing to note, is that trainings are a way forward here, but it's not an easy pill, you know, you just take the red pill and all of a sudden implicit bias is gone, right?
So
Where is implicit bias coming from, right?
Step one, this is a long-term endeavor.
Yeah, this is, our society has a lot of messages that are wonderful and a lot of messages that lack that kind of wonder, right? And that facilitate inequality. And those messages are going to be bombarded on us all the time. And so talking to me for 90 minutes will help you, hopefully, but it doesn't do it, right? It doesn't do the trick. You need to become aware of your own implicit biases. You need to think through, how does this affect the way I deal with people on a daily basis, on a moment-to-moment basis? And then you need to think through strategies of what can I do to employ these techniques in the future, so that I'm at least an agent of positive change in this regard. The real answer is, when does society change so that stereotypic associations of certain group members and aggression and violence and inability to do cognitive tasks, right, or compliance, when do those stereotypes stop getting bombarded?
Right, on us.
Yeah, and there's I mean, that's kind of a depressing story to tell. People used to think, oh, the new internet age is coming and we'll transcend all this. And you hear people talking about, a post-racial world, but the statistics
Don't bear it
do
out.
not indicate, and no,
Yeah.
not at all.
Yeah.
I mean, not at all. So our society, we ultimately have to take responsibility for what's going on in our own
part of the world.
minds,
Right,
because as part of an effort to
Mm-hmm.
make change, right? So what is the biggest agent of change? How do we de-bias people? The biggest change agent in de-biasing is seeing people who are counter stereotypes. So if you hold stereotypes about members of certain groups, in Hawaii you hold a stereotype of a member of a certain immigrant group as being violent or being, having bad family values or not being smart. And then you have contact with the criminal justice system, and your parole officer is from that group. You see a person in that position of authority. Your judge is from that group.
Right.
All of a sudden you see people who are counter stereotypes.
Right.
I mean, a male nurse is like the most simple example of this, right?
Right.
We stereotype nurses as women. Women lawyers, right? People think women judges. You think judge? If I say judge, what pops into your head, right? Is it a woman?
Or a man.
Right.
Absolutely.
It tends to be a man. So
Correct.
counter stereotypes help. And if we are aware of that, that can actually have effects too.
Now, again, I will try to gauge the question from someone who would challenge you a little bit on this.
Please.
Is there a chance that in attempting to identify our own biases or biases within an institution that we may overshoot the problem and just wind up at a place where other people are subjected to our response in trying to de-bias ourselves? Is there a potential where we overprotect?
I mean, I wouldn't say that that's not possible, right? I mean, I think this is a fluid and dynamic world, and people act in certain ways. And if I go over the top and I say, I'm going to be a personal de-biasing agent of change, and I'm not going to do anything consistent with societal stereotypes, maybe that could have negative effects on people who don't deserve it. On the other hand, I think that's much less finding
That's
people
much
like
less
that
harmful
is
than-
much less of a concern.
Okay.
Because there aren't many of them out there, right? And if there are, they're not reversing the cultural damage.
In an institutional way. They're not.
I mean, so there's a female CEO of Yahoo. Let's just say hypothetically that people wanted a woman as the CEO of Yahoo, and she didn't have on paper the exact same or better experience as another candidate.
Okay.
And they decided we want her to be our new CEO of Yahoo.
Right.
That doesn't bother me at all, right?
Okay.
Because I think if you aggregate the positive effects of counter stereotypes, that's good for the company too, right? Yahoo has done wonders for itself. Now I doubt that was their intention, but I don't think that there are a lot of institutional examples where you could find that people's efforts to combat implicit bias has ultimately harmed it. I mean, all the studies in the corporate sector, or most of the studies in the corporate sector, show that gender diversity on boards, for example, which is a major issue, that helps profits.
Okay.
So, and they also show that the average woman on their corporate boards doesn't have as much paper experience as the men on their boards, but nonetheless their corporations are more profitable. So what does that say? Right?
Exactly. So what can we do to help further the work that you're doing? How do we support what obviously is such good work that you're doing?
Well, you should buy the book.
Okay.
In large quantities.
In
No.
large quantities.
Oh, I'm just kidding. Well, no, you should. You should at least read the book.
The book is
You
fantastic.
should borrow the book from your local library. No, but I think we all have to reflect on what our roles are
Okay.
in society, right? And become aware of them and ask the hard questions. I'm a professor. I have to ask the hard questions of myself. Do I view students from private school backgrounds in ways that are different than public school backgrounds that are going to harm? Do I view students, who are not native speakers of English in a certain way? Do I view women students as less likely to be going into science type fields, intellectual property law, things like that? I have to ask the hard questions of myself, and I think that's the first thing that we all ought to do.
And that would support your work on the grassroots level.
Yeah, I think the grassroots level is where this has to go. On a policy level, I think the decision makers who are committed to egalitarian organizations need to also think hard about this, right? That most of their employees do view themselves as egalitarian, but often have no awareness that their implicit biases are in conflict with their self-reported beliefs. So they ought to take the kind of responsibility within their organization and start to say, well, how do I improve my organization? My message to them is that it's not just a societal responsibility, but that it enhances your organization's bottom line. I mean, I believe that.
So in those instances where someone might challenge you and say, well, then doesn't this do a disservice to a meritocracy if you start to engage these questions about implicit bias? What's your response?
I think that is a meritocracy. I mean, look at the stereotype threat research. We're not picking the best people for the job. There's resume studies. Having a black sounding name on a resume takes away an average of 8 years experience when people are perceiving that resume, right? These are hiring studies done in real jobs where the same resumes, they changed the names and sent them out, and they measured who got called for interviews. A black sounding name, or flipped around, a white sounding name was worth 8 years of additional experience compared to a black sounding name. So you want a meritocracy, you want a better organization, you want to think about these things. Yeah.
Excellent, excellent. So let's move on to another topic, and this topic is more personal. How did you get involved in this kind of work? I know you started the session today with saying if you're inspired by justice, then you should be thinking about implicit bias. But how did you get started doing this, and how can other people get into this kind of work? Because it seems like we need more people in the front lines doing this work.
Yeah. Well, and I think you're right, that needs to happen. For me, it really was reflection on daily life, right? How do people perceive me, react to me, perceive others, react to others, and how do I go about manifesting my own biases in a daily life? And that kind of reflection, combined with a love for social science, led me to start reading the social science work in this field and realizing how it applied in a way that was so much, much beyond me, right, and a lot more important. So I think, one simple thing people can do, there are tests out there now that have been developed that are actually publicly available. The implicit association test, called the IAT, is a very simple computer game style test that's available on the internet. People just have to look up
IAT.
Implicit association test, or they could Google something called Project Implicit and take a demonstration test.
Excellent.
And they would actually receive feedback. They could choose what kind of test they want to take. They could receive immediate feedback on their own biases.
Excellent. Well, let's take a break. I'm Danielle Conway. I'm here speaking with Professor Justin Levinson. We're talking about implicit bias. This is Think Tech Live, and we will be back.
Aloha, I'm Nicole Horry for Think Tech. For nearly half a century, the Hawaii Foreign Trade Zone No. 9 has brought the benefits of the Foreign Trade Zone program to Hawaii businesses and entrepreneurs. DBET, the Department of Business, Economic Development, and Tourism, operates Hawaii's Foreign Trade Zone program to encourage international business and economic development. The Foreign Trade Zone's mission is to increase the amount of international trading activity in Hawaii, thereby providing employment opportunities for the residents of our island state. For more information, see ftz9.org. I'm Nicole Horry. Mahalo.
Welcome back. I'm Danielle Conway. This is Life in the Law on Think Tech Live. I am here with Professor Justin Levinson, and we have just over 5 more minutes, and I want to talk about how to get individuals, students, professionals more engaged in the studies and
Right.
the projects that you are doing on implicit bias to combat and de-bias, while at the same time making us a more productive society, making us a more equal community, and making us aware of some of these issues? What can people do?
I mean, I think the most obvious thing people can do is reach out and ask how they can get involved, right? So people could email me, call me, and say, I'm working at this kind of organization. I think these types of things might be issues, and then we could try to respond and get people involved and say, well, what is it that would help this organization? Should they have trainings, for example, informal conversations, whatever it is.
And you teach a law and psychology class at the law school.
Right.
Do you open that up to people at all, or do you like to keep the class in a more closed seminar setting?
That one is a seminar class by design so that the students feel comfortable opening up. We are broadening that class to graduate students in psychology next year so that we'll be cross-fertilizing the graduate programs.
Okay.
But that class, I should say, I do teach a one-class unit on implicit bias in there. But that's really about broader decision-making, problem-solving issues within the legal system too.
So how do we open up the doors at the law school to, say, institutional actors who might want to engage in the projects that you do in this area?
Well, I've created something called the Culture and Jury Project, which essentially is an interdisciplinary laboratory with collaborators all around the world. And the idea is that people can come in and pursue interests that they have. So let's say I want to run a cross-cultural study in Japan and the US regarding the new Japanese lay assessor jury type system. I have collaborators in Japan. I do work with them. We get students involved, and we can test how the new jury system is working in Japan. If we have people who are within a government agency or even a private corporation, if they want to come in, they can call me up. We can figure out how to get them involved. It might involve pilot testing within their organization, right? We might test new trainings to figure out which ones are working better in different sectors. We can run trainings for them. We can start research projects. The other thing is, I think, for people in the community to realize that at the law school we're doing a lot of different work, right? This is just my work. We have a lot of people interested in justice at our law school. It's part of our mission. It's a great time to start law school. We have so many course offerings. So, that's another possibility. We have an evening program, so people who are working full-time can come to law school and often finish in about 4 years just on the evenings and sometimes in the weekends. So there's ways for people to get involved in that way too, and then they become agents of change in the policy sense as lawyers, improving their own careers.
Well, that's fantastic. You really are a shining light at the law school, and the work you're doing is cutting edge work. I know you are a humble person, but it really is one of the places where implicit bias is being studied and seriously, and not a lot of places are doing that. So.
I would say, besides me, our faculty probably is the best law faculty in the world on issues of implicit bias. We have 7 or 8 law faculty members, including you and many others, who have been thinking about these issues for a long time. Right? People like Charles Lawrence on our law faculty, Linda Krieger, they're the 2 first people to really bring this type of knowledge into the forefront of the discourse. And then you have people who've been on our law faculty for a long time, like Eric Yamamoto, who's been working on redress issues and justice. And Eric took on the concept of implicit bias and wrote a chapter about implicit bias in reparations and redress for the book. So we're actually coming together as an intellectual community, and with the students too, to really push this further. And I think that's one of the things that makes our school unique. I know you would agree.
I think I do agree with you. I want to end, and hopefully you can say quickly how the students are responding in your class, and how has this empowered them? How has this knowledge empowered them?
And I wouldn't say this is just true for students, but for all the people that open their eyes to implicit bias and what's going on within them, I think there's a process. At least half of them are surprised when they find their test results. And many of them really start to think about how they're doing things in this world that aren't exactly what they want to do, and what role they can play. And I think that's tremendous progress. That's the kind of progress we should all be hoping to make in life.
Thank you. I'm Danielle Conway. This has been Life in the Law on Think Tech live streaming network series. Thank you for joining us and have a very good evening.